And even going from 1970 to 1990, in America, adults consume now 1,000% more fructose. It's not just the calories, it's not just that it's a sugar, it is a powerful signal to our physiology to shift from being a fat burning machine, keeping blood sugar low, to being a fat manufacturing and storage machine and keeping blood sugar high.
Welcome back to the podcast. How you been?
I've been very well, and thanks for having me. Glad to be back.
Yeah, this is, I think, our fourth time together, and it's been a little while. And I have to admit, I really enjoyed the new book, but it was a bit of a curveball. I didn't see that topic coming. Uric acid. So let's talk about the origin there, and given the history of your previous writings, this would you admit this was kind of a curveball for the audience?
No,
Okay.
and I'll tell you why. Because even going way back almost 10 years ago to Grain Brain, it was all about disturbances of metabolism and how they affect the body and, how they affect the brain. How things like insulin resistance, elevated blood sugar, elevated blood pressure, increased body fat, all pave the way because they're metabolic disorders, all pave the way for things like inflammation and what the fundamental role is of these events in causing brain issues, body issues, heart issues, diabetes. So, through that lens of metabolic disturbance, understanding the role of uric acid then a perfect part of the continuum, then, isn't it?
Yeah, when you give that background. But, when I crack open the book and start reading, I'm like, okay, this is different. But
Well, I think even beforehand, when you look at the title, the title is drop acid. People say, "Whoa, where'd Perlmutter go on this one?" And to be clear, the acid that we want people to lower is called uric acid, and we've known about uric acid for an awful long time. We as medical doctors always checked uric acid, but it was always in the context of if it's elevated, it's a risk factor for gout and kidney stones. And that was sort of the end of story. And now, the past 20 years have provided this robust data set that shows that uric acid is really a key player in regulating our metabolism. There was a great study put out by Japanese and Turkish researchers together back in 2016, and the title of their paper is "Uric Acid in Metabolic Syndrome: From Innocent Bystander to Central Player." So it's not that high levels of uric acid happen to be there when you're overweight, diabetic, insulin resistant, hypertension. Well, they are there, but they're actually, this uric acid is playing a role in actually causing these problems. And that's an incredible bit of information to have. Why? Because we can target uric acid. Obviously, Jess, that's what we're going to be talking about today, but we can lower uric acid and really gain a much better control over these fundamental metabolic issues that underlie our most dreaded conditions. So this is a powerful new tool.
definitely. Well, let's start out with the basics. Let's talk about, we know now that this is something we want to lower. Where is it coming from?
Well, we all have uric acid in our bodies, and it's the downstream product of only three things, and that makes it really simple for when you take the quiz. So you'll be able to get that one correct. It'll be answer A, B, C, and then all those together. And so the biggest issue in our time, without question, is fructose. And we talk a lot about fructose in the book. We've known since the really powerful article appearing in the journal The Lancet in 1970 that uric acid that at least that fructose consumption is associated with higher levels or higher risk for metabolic disturbance. We never understood why. And then that came face to face with, the sugar lobby, the corn lobby saying, "Oh no, fructose is great because it doesn't require insulin, so it's a good sugar to eat." And it was not the case then. It's certainly not the case now. But, there was this idea for, 3 decades that if you're going to eat sugar, eat fructose because it's the better choice, high fructose corn syrup. Now we know that that's just not the case. So fructose is directly metabolized into uric acid. And I'm going to focus on that for just a few minutes. The other two are purines, the breakdown product of DNA and RNA from certain foods, from our own muscle mass, for example. And the third input is alcohol. But let's stay with fructose for just a minute, because it's really a fascinating story. And I talk about it at great length in the book because it is a survival mechanism. Consuming fructose in the form of ripened fruit at the end of the summer or in the early fall was a powerful signal for our hunter-gatherer ancestors and even for primates before that, that winter's coming. Make fat, store fat, increase blood pressure, turn on your body's production of glucose. And that allowed them to survive. So those individuals that had higher levels of uric acid, because that's the danger signal, which makes more fat, makes more blood sugar, for example. Those that had a tendency to make more uric acid would be the ones to survive and reproduce. So we all carry that legacy now. We, as humans, will create about 4 to 5 times more uric acid than other mammals, for example. Not all primates, of course, because we carry this set of mutations in the genes that make an enzyme called uricase that would normally have broken down our uric acid. But in us, we don't have uricase. So our uric acid levels are very, very high because it was a survival mechanism. It was a good thing to have a little more fat. It was a good thing to make sugar. It was a good thing to have a little bit elevated blood pressure compared to those who did not. That allowed us to survive. Evolutionarily, a powerful survival mechanism to make more uric acid. But in today's world, when we're signaling this pathway by having incredible amounts of this fructose in our diets, we see what happens. It goes to uric acid. Uric acid says winter's coming, make fat, raise the blood pressure, make more blood sugar, become insulin resistant, which were all good things, hard to imagine, in the context of keeping us from starving. But today, you look around, we have a third of American adults are obese. In the year 2030, that'll be a half, 50% in the distant future, 2030. And I used to think that way. Oh, 2030, that'll never, the glaciers will have melted by then. That's 8 years from now. I mean, that's right around the corner when half of all American adults, not just overweight, but obese. We see now 10% of children between the ages of 12 and 19 having high blood pressure, hypertensive kids. Who ever heard of such craziness? And so it's not that we've suddenly changed genetically, but we've kind of tilted the table with respect to the interplay between our Paleolithic genome, if you will, and the current environment that's giving us that fructose 365 days a year. You go to the grocery store, and there are more than 2 million products sold in America's grocery stores. And of those that are packaged, carry a barcode, more than 60% have added sweetener because we find that appealing. And why do we find it appealing? Because we all have a sweet tooth. That was a survival mechanism. It told us that that food is safe to eat and would help us survive through the winter. But, this added sweetener to all of our foods is by and large either fructose itself or high fructose corn syrup or some derivative thereof. And it's targeting this mechanism, telling our bodies, get ready for winter because you won't have any food. It's this evolutionary environmental mismatch that, we can't change our genes, but we can sure work on the other side of that balance beam and work on our environment, on the foods we eat, the sleep we get, the exercise we get, the nature exposure, the stress reduction. All of those things play into giving our genome what it more readily accepts and what it can use as information to keep us healthy.
In that example you gave, where you talked about in history how fructose was part of a survival mechanism getting us ready for the cooler months, you used fruit in that example. So I'm sure a lot of people are thinking, fruit, we know now it contains fructose. Is this something that I should only be eating, before winter? Is this something that I can, have in certain intervals? Or what do I do about fruit?
Well, I have to admit that in every interview I have done with reference to this new book, that question has come up early in the conversation. And as it turns out, fruit in moderation does not elevate uric acid. And though it contains some fructose, but whole fruit doesn't contain an awful lot of fructose. An apple might have maybe 5 to 10 grams, but it's the context. It has that amount of fructose, but number one, you don't drink it down quickly, so it's a little bit slower delivery. Number two, it comes packaged with fiber that further slows its absorption, so you don't get this sudden surge of fructose in your body triggering uric acid. Number three, it's packaged along with two other very important things, one being bioflavonoids that actually reduce uric acid production. We'll talk about that later on when we talk about supplements. And also vitamin C that actually enhances uric acid excretion or urination of uric acid out so your levels don't elevate. So what the data shows, which is really quite interesting and gratefully surprising, is that moderate fruit consumption, an apple a day keeps the doctor away, maybe a couple of apples. Could you go overboard? Of course you could. Did our ancestors go overboard? Hopefully they did. That's what let them survive. When you look at what a bear will eat prior to hibernating, it's massive, massive amounts of berries day in and day out, triggering mechanisms in its body to shift it over to fat production, locking up fat, reducing metabolism, getting ready to hibernate when that fat is then used as a source of calories and a source of fresh water.
So, other than what is probably obvious to a lot of people, the high fructose corn syrup, what other sources of fructose do we have to avoid?
Well, when I say the fruit is okay, then people are thinking, well, great, I'll have that 16-ounce or 12-ounce glass of orange juice each morning because Dr. Perlmutter said that's okay. That is exactly what you do not want to do. So we've been looking at literature for years that has demonstrated that not only soft drink consumption, sugar sweetened soft drink, but fruit juice itself is associated with shrinkage of the brain and declining memory performance. We didn't really understand why until the uric acid piece of that puzzle was delivered. So, while fruit, because it has higher levels of fiber, vitamin C, quercetin, and other bioflavonoids, is reasonable, and indeed the fructose content is, as I said, 5 to 10 grams, having 36 grams of sugar in a glass of orange juice is way too much and is associated with a fairly dramatic risk of increase of uric acid. So that's off the table. I mean, if you want to have a glass of fruit juice, then dilute it significantly. You'll still get the sense that you're drinking orange juice or apple juice, but dilute it down so that you're not confronting your body immediately by a surge of fructose, which is telling your body, we're not going to have calories pretty soon. Better get ready for it. Fructose is in so many foods, as mentioned earlier, so many packaged foods, condiments, sauces, uh, tomato paste, tomato sauce, you name it. More than half the foods that you will find on the grocery store shelf have added sweetener. And by and large, that is a form of fructose. So you have to be a conscious label reader and recognize that this is appealing to you because you have a sweet tooth. And I'm not accusing you, Jesse, of having a sweet tooth, pointing fingers. Every person walking the planet has a sweet tooth, myself included. We all love sugar. That's not an app that we loaded in after the fact. That's part of the hard drive that came when you bought your brain computer. It's part of our deepest programming to seek out sugar. Why? Because that is a powerful survival mechanism telling you eat that food at this time to get the most nutritional value out of it. And also, that's the time when that fruit is able to spread its seeds. So it worked for everyone. But by all means, we've got to become aware of the massive amount of fructose that we're eating, going from 1900s, 1920s to the present. The amount of fructose that we as Americans consume has increased from about most 15 grams per day, now about 55 grams per day. And even going from 1970 to 1990, in America, adults consume now 1,000% more fructose. It's not just the calories. It's not just that it's a sugar. It is a powerful signal to our physiology to shift from being a fat burning machine, keeping blood sugar low, to being a fat manufacturing and storage machine and keeping blood sugar high. Again, in the context of our history, that was a great mechanism. That's why we have that mechanism on board. But now we're sending wrong signals to that mechanism. And the good news is we can override that, make better choices, and recognize that the alarm signal itself is uric acid. So that is something we want to have our doctors check, or we check at home using a monitor like you can buy for blood sugar. You can buy the same thing for uric acid on Amazon or wherever you want to go, and check your uric acid, know what it is.
So a basic rule of thumb for people then is stick with whole foods, and then in that case, when it comes to fructose, things will basically take care of themselves.
That's right. And, there are some people who genetically may have higher uric acid. And how would you know till you check? Well, interestingly, if you go to the doctor for your so-called annual blood work and they do a 20 component panel, typically that will include uric acid. And if you ask the doctor, oh, I see my uric acid is 6.5, then she or he will say to you, oh, that's great. It's in the normal range, nothing to worry about. But you got to remember that that statement, that response is in the context of gout. Gout is a disease caused by pretty much by elevation of uric acid. Generally, the cutoff for being considered normal is 7 milligrams per deciliter or above. At that level, the doctor starts to say, well, your uric acid level is higher, you're at risk for gout. Well, that's sort of your grandfather's uric acid. We now recognize, with robust research for the past 2 decades, that even subtle elevation of uric acid above 5.5 milligrams per deciliter is putting you in the risk category for all kinds of metabolic issues. One very large study in 2009 looked at 42,000 men and 48,000 women. That's 90,000 people, followed them for 8 years. At the beginning of the study, what did they do? They measured their uric acid level. End of story. And after the 8 years, they asked who died, and if you did die, what did you die of? They found that those in the higher ranges of uric acid had a 16% increased risk of death from what we call all cause mortality, meaning they got to be dead people who knows why. But more importantly, there was a 38% increased risk of what is called cardiovascular mortality, dying of a heart-related event, a 35% increased risk of dying of stroke. And really intriguing was their finding that for every 1 point elevation above 7, which is so common these days, each point is associated with an additional 8 to 13% increased risk in what is called all-cause mortality. That's worrisome. We now have teased apart the very straightforward mechanisms that relate elevated uric acid to these issues: dying of a heart attack, dying of a stroke. We know that elevated uric acid threatens the arteries in terms of their ability to relax and supply blood. We know that elevated uric acid increases what's called insulin resistance, so our blood sugars go up. That's a surefire way to amp up inflammation in the human body. The brain hates that. So, these are now finally coming to light. And once you've seen these mechanisms and understand them, you realize, wow, this explains so much. It explains why this was a survival mechanism and why so darn many people these days are really in bad shape. 88% of American adults has one or more of the components of what is called metabolic syndrome: the high blood pressure, the insulin resistance, the big belly, the dyslipidemia, the elevated triglycerides. That means only 1 in 8 American adults is metabolically intact. 50% of Americans over the age of 60 will have will have 3 of those 5 components, and therefore is diagnosable as having the metabolic syndrome. And that is an entree to so many things that you don't want to get.
You've named a lot of different things that go wrong in the body with the elevated uric acid, and highlighted the point that it's not about just getting to that level. I think it was 7 or above that the medical doctors are typically looking at for gout. Are there subtle signs though? Like obviously you talked about heart attack, stroke, and a lot of things where it's likely too late for a person if they get to that point and their uric acid is at that level. But are there subtle things people can notice day in, day out that are going to start to decline with their health and wellness at that lower range. And I know you mentioned the testing, so obviously that's the easiest way. But for somebody listening right now and they're wondering, is there certain things they can look out for?
You bet. And that's why we wrote the book. It's for those individuals who, are telling me that, doc, I do the best I can on my diet. I follow a whatever the diet may be, whether it's vegan or paleo or whatever it may be. I am trying to exercise. I'm paying attention to my sleep, and I've done well, but I've not gotten where I want to get. So, there's a lot of people who are looking. They know darn well there's another piece of the puzzle that they haven't leveraged yet, and that's what this is all about. So, with people who are starting to develop problems with their blood sugar, maybe they have a continuous glucose monitor and they're seeing that their levels seem to be coming up these days despite their best efforts. So, this signal might be in the on position saying, hey, we're going to raise your blood pressure and we need to make more fat because that's what the signaling is all about. So, the easiest thing though is get your uric acid level checked. Doctors will check it. And sometimes it's just as easy as making a phone call to your doctor's office and say, hey, by the way, what was my uric acid last year when you checked it? And again, be prepared for the response of, well, it was 6.8, and that's in the normal range. And I would respond by saying two things. First of all, for people that I'm dealing with, I don't like the term in the normal range because that is average. And average health in North America is not very good. I would like people to be in the optimal, tip top range. What is best for you? Not just, what's going to be about what everybody else has. People that are dialing in and wanting good information, wanting this level of empowerment, need to know not just what is average, but what is optimal. And optimal is 5.5 or below. And second, if you didn't have a uric acid level check, then by all means, go online, buy a monitor. I use one called UAssure, UASURE. There are many of them out there. And check your uric acid level and become familiar with it and watch how it changes based upon, not only the food you eat, the alcohol you consume, the sleep that you get or not, the exercise you get or not. Watch how your lifestyle choices affect your uric acid level, much as people are now watching how their lifestyle choices affect their blood sugar.
You mentioned that 5.5 being the optimal range. Is that across the board, whether you're male, female?
It
As we
is.
age, are we trying to adjust for that?
We could generally females have at least premenopausal have a slightly lower uric acid, but in males and females, that's the top level. So women have an advantage then because of estrogen helping with uric acid excretion. After menopause, their uric acid levels go up fairly significantly. And interestingly, in women who are on ERT or estrogen replacement therapy or hormone replacement therapy, their uric acid levels actually are lower than those women who are not taking hormone replacement therapy. I'm not saying that I would advocate taking hormone replacement therapy just to lower uric acid. There are other considerations, cancer, heart disease, brain health, etc., that women should think about and discuss with their doctors prior to starting hormone replacement therapy. But it's an interesting observation. We used to think that, well, men have higher uric acid because they're eating more meat, getting more purines in their diet, and boys as well. Boys have a higher uric acid than girls. But it turns out it's likely the estrogen story that explains that difference.
And I know about 10 or 15 years ago in the health and wellness space, agave became a healthy, quote unquote, natural sweetener. And I know you're not a fan from reading your book, and you talk about how high the fructose content is in that sweetener. So I'm curious, are there other alternative sweeteners out there that people are using that are better and worse when it comes to fructose?
Sure. I haven't heard from the agave trade association yet, but who knows? That may happen. I certainly years ago heard from the gluten, whatever it was, the Wheat Growers Society, but I would steer clear of agave. It's called nectar, like the fruit of the gods. But man, 70% fructose. I would steer clear of that. I would say that for sweeteners. By and large, avoid them. Try to cultivate a sense that you're not as enamored with stimulating yourself with sweet day in and day out. And the less of it you do, the less you'll probably want it, but it'll never fully go away. If there is the call for a sweetener, I like monk fruit and allulose. I think they are reasonable. Believe it or not, even though it contains fructose, using a small amount of honey in a recipe or in your tea. I recently posted on Instagram, honey, I'm sorry, will you ever forgive me? And then I explained what that meant. It was the largest post I've ever done on Instagram because people thought I was apologizing to my wife. What I was doing was I was apologizing because for years I've been kind of knocking honey because it has fructose in it, saying, "Hey, that's not a good thing to be eating." But interestingly, there is data that really validates honey in terms of being metabolically appropriate. That consuming honey might actually have a positive metabolic input as it relates to blood sugar regulation because it contains a lot of different other compounds that may be good for metabolism. So Dr. Perlmutter admitted that my messaging may not have been completely sound as it related to honey. Now, again, you want to be careful with an amount. If you want to consume a teaspoon of honey, I can't foresee that that is necessarily going to challenge your uric acid level, but be surprised, with other foods. For example, I mentioned purines. Purines are these breakdown products from DNA and RNA and foods that have a lot of cells in them. Each cell contains DNA and or RNA in the nucleus. These hypercellular foods tend to increase the production of purines, and that could increase uric acid production. It's the reason, for example, that gout patients are told to avoid organ meats like liver and kidney and processed meats and small fish like sardines and anchovies. Can you eat them? Sure, you can if you're watching your uric acid and seeing how it affects you. If you're cutting out fructose completely and you decide you want to have some anchovies on your salad, it's not going to be a big threat. But when you have a lot of purines, like you would get from a certain beverage, we'll get there in a moment, then you can, really have an effect on your all of your metabolism. Let's talk about alcohol, the third player, for just a moment. The research demonstrates that women who consume a little bit of wine actually it's associated with a lower uric acid level, and in men it's about neutral. Hard liquor is associated with an elevation of uric acid to a moderate degree in both men and women, but the big player is beer. Beer stimulates uric acid. Yes, it contains alcohol, but beer is exquisitely high in purines, that breakdown product of DNA and RNA. Why would that be? Because beer is made with yeast, and yeast is very hypercellular, contains a lot of DNA and RNA, and that contributes to the purine pool. And so you're hitting that uric acid formation through both alcohol and purines. And that explains then, as we know, uric acid makes us fat, explains the beer belly. People wonder, well, where's it coming from? You see some beers have really low calories, light beer, have less than 100 calories, and yet people are still getting fat. It's not the calories we're talking about here. It's the alcohol and the purines to the extent that now, at least in Japan, which is, kind of leading the vanguard here in terms of uric acid and metabolism, they have on the market several beers that are purine free, not alcohol free. They have that as well. We've known that for years, but marketing beers that are purine free because they fully understand the role of purines in raising uric acid and therefore contributing to why people get fat.
So let's talk about the purines for a bit because I think that's an area people could get a little bit confused in because a lot of the previous guests on the show advocate for eating organ meats as being super nutritional. And I don't think you'd argue that point, but we're talking from a purine perspective here. And then also things like red meat and fish. And so what for somebody who is going to consume those, say on a moderate level, is there certain things that we can eat alongside them or certain supplements we can take when we know we're taking in a moderate amount of purines in a meal to help dampen that conversion to uric acid?
That's an excellent question. And, in the book, we have, several sections dedicated to what and how to eat. And indeed, we supply recipes, and some of them are chicken and red meat. And We don't have recipes dealing with the organ meats because of their purine content being so high, but there are plenty of purines in red meat and white meat and in fish, and but yet, here's where two things come into play. Number one, being judicious about your quantities. 6 ounces is not unreasonable. I do that myself, and I know my uric acid level runs around 4.5. Uh, and number two, looking at the differences between the various foods in terms of their purine content. Even some vegetables can be pretty darn high in purines, like mushrooms and the cruciferous vegetables. They have quite a bit of purines, but the data shows that on balance, they do not raise uric acid, and therefore I would say eat them with abandon. If you choose to eat various types of meat and fish, etc., go for it, but watch your portion size. Be more judicious as it relates to eating the organ meats and the game meats, the venison, for example, the deer, the ostrich, whatever you may eat, because again, they're a little bit more hypercellular, have a little bit more purines that they will produce. But it really depends, and then this point number two, on the individual. How does he or she respond to the consumption of those purines? Two-thirds of the purines in your physiology right now are not from the foods that you eat, but are actually from the breakdown and the recycling of your own tissues. Especially if you exercise aggressively, you'll break down muscle tissue. And as those cells are broken down, they are going to liberate their DNA and RNA, and your body will convert them to purines, which will ultimately increase the uric acid. It's why, as in our book, we talk about when to check uric acid. And one of the times that you don't want to check it is that next morning after a really vigorous workout. I did an interview yesterday with a woman named Gabby Reese. She's an Olympic gold medal winner in women's beach volleyball. And, she's a very high-end athlete. And I said, when you're moving forward and going to check your uric acid, you sure don't want to check it the next morning after a very vigorous workout. So keep those things in mind. Now, what about the mitigators that you talk about or bring up? Very, very good point. The early research in looking at controlling uric acid, the interventional trials that first began with laboratory rodents and then moved on to humans, would elevate uric acid aggressively by giving first the rodents and then in human studies something called, who knew, fructose. In the drinking water of the rodents, or just saying to these test subjects, over the next couple of weeks, you're going to drink 200 grams of fructose a day, which seems like a lot, but I bet you there's some teenagers who do that. And immediately in the animals and in humans, they would develop all kinds of metabolic issues like high blood pressure. And what they found and published was that here they develop high blood pressure, their uric acid level goes up, they gain weight, uh, and what is causing that? Is it directly from the fructose? Well, what they did was really quite clever. They gave them all this fructose, but they gave them a drug that is used actually to treat gout that would reduce the production of the uric acid. So still getting the fructose and now blocking uric acid production, and lo and behold, the metabolic issues did not occur. So that really helps us identify that the player here is uric acid. That's the signal that your body uses to gain the weight, to raise the blood pressure, to become insulin resistant. So this drug, allopurinol, a relatively safe drug, so the studies were conducted. Nonetheless, we know that certain bioflavonoids like quercetin work and luteolin work in such a way, targeting the exact same pathway that allopurinol works, and that is targeting a very important enzymatic step in the formation of uric acid called xanthine oxidase. So these natural products available from the health food store, 500 milligrams, my recommendation for quercetin, 100 milligrams for luteolin, work in the very same way. Now, it doesn't mean that, you pop a couple quercetins and off you go drinking a couple of cans of soda and everything's going to be rosy. Maybe it will be, but you have to be darn sure that your program is one that allows you to follow your uric acid levels and make changes based upon these inputs to keep it where it needs to be.
And when you talked about that study with rodents, you mentioned they were using fructose. Has there been any research or anything that you've come across that when it comes to the purines, that it can block that conversion as well, or do the same supplements work in both
Yes,
cases?
this xanthine oxidase targeting is downstream from purine metabolism, so that will encompass the purine inroads to uric acid as well. So, again, this is, the fundamentals here are really not to end the uric acid once it's elevated and accumulating in the body, but to really look at where did it come from in the first place. And there are three inputs I mentioned: fructose, the purines, and certainly alcohol. But there's one other player that I want to talk about because I think it's really very important, and that is that dietary salt. What does it do? Dietary salt helps convert the blood sugar that we have, the glucose, into fructose. So it's not just the fructose that we consume in the various foods that we eat and should avoid, but we can actually enhance our own endogenous production of this signal, this warning signal, through fructose metabolism to get ready for winter. Dietary salt is telling us that, well, it's not really relevant in terms of food availability. It's telling us, it's simulating in our bodies that we are dehydrated. When you don't have water, the first thing that happens is your sodium goes up in your bloodstream, and that puts into play a variety of mechanisms that help your body conserve water. And one of those mechanisms, either if you become dehydrated or you simulate it by consuming a lot of sodium, is the manufacturing of fructose from glucose. Now, what does that do? Fructose downstream becomes uric acid, and that tells your body, get ready for winter, make fat. Now, why would you want to make fat if you're dehydrated? What would be the connection? Well, it turns out that when you metabolize fat, you are producing in your body two things: carbon dioxide and free fresh water. Body fat is a wonderful storage depot from which your body can make water to help you survive when you can't find water. Uh, you know, what do you think the camel's hump is all about? That's not filled with water. It's not like you could stick a straw into a camel's hump and have water when you're crossing the desert. It's full of fat. As much as 80 pounds it can weigh, the camel's hump. And what does that allow that camel to do? Sure, these are fat calories that allow it to have a source of energy. But beyond that, it turns the fat into water so that camel can survive walking across the desert. Um, Whales are very, very fat, but they don't have any source of fresh water. They live in salt water. They don't look around for an underwater spring and drink the water. They are making fresh water, which they need in their physiology. They don't drink seawater. They're making fresh water from their body fat. So, one of the fattest animals on the planet in terms of percentage of body weight that's fat is the hummingbird. Who knew? These hummingbirds make these thousands of mile treks, from North America to South America or wherever they end up going. And prior to that, as much as 40% of their body weight can be fat. And if you want hummingbirds in your backyard, what do? You put out a container of sugar water. What is table sugar? Sucrose. It's 50% fructose. So they are triggering this mechanism. They're laying down body fat, and lo and behold, they have energy source for their long trip and a source of water for their long trip as well. So it's interesting to consider that making body fat was a survival mechanism, not just because it gave us a source of energy and insulated us against the cold, but it also is a depot from which we can make fresh water.
So to make sure I have the salt piece right, the way salt fits in is the fact that it's going to dehydrate us, and that's what's going to trigger the cascade.
It's not going to dehydrate us. Actually, quite the contrary. It makes our physiology think that we are dehydrated. When you get dehydrated, salt concentration goes up, and a variety of mechanisms are activated, saying, "Oh, I'm dehydrated. I better conserve water." Things like vasopressin, for example, are activated. Things like an enzyme aldose reductase are activated. That's the enzyme that converts glucose into fructose, telling as a signal to help your body ultimately through uric acid make fat so that you can have water. So the consumption of salt, sitting on the couch and eating those pretzels day in and day out, the salt rises in your bloodstream, and that's what these mechanisms in the kidney sense. They say, "Oh my gosh, high salt. This person isn't drinking enough water, becoming dehydrated. We better put into play these mechanisms so that there's more fat, so they can make more water, and that will help them survive." So, if you decided you're going to sit on the couch and eat a box of pretzels that are laden with salt, which I used to love, by the way, those big crunchy pretzels. I think they were called Snyder's. They were delicious. But if you do that, the antidote here is just drink a lot of water when you're doing it so that the salt concentration does not go up.
Got it. So it's a balance between water intake and the salt intake.
Exactly right. And, we've known for an awful long time that there's a strong correlation with salt consumption and obesity and type 2 diabetes. There is an interesting study in the Journal of the American Medical Association where they had two groups of school children, and outside the classroom of the one group, the intervention group, they put a water fountain. That's the only intervention. And they encouraged the kids to drink water during the course of the day. The other group, status quo, no changes. And the group, after a time, that had access to water over the school year, there was a 30% reduced risk of obesity in that group. So, I think people don't really understand this powerful connection between salt consumption. I think everybody's pretty clued in that, yeah, it leads to high blood pressure, but it makes you fat. So that's something to think about. That's a very important tool, in this discussion of uric acid. Yes, you want to avoid the fructose and think about the type of alcohol you consume and maybe consider dramatic reduction of your purine intake if you can't get your uric acid level down. But salt consumption plays into this as well.
And personally, when you're, getting ready to sit down and eat a meal, do you ever put exogenous salt on that, or is that something you avoid now?
There is plenty of salt, obviously in food anyway. I've stopped using the salt shaker, and I'm really gravitating a lot more towards pepper for a number of reasons. Black pepper, especially when we use turmeric in the meal, if it's an Indian meal, because black pepper, Pipera nigrans, actually helps with the absorption of turmeric, which, as we all know, is really a helpful uh, component of your meal, if because anti-inflammatory properties, etc. So I don't use salt shaker anymore. That's correct.
Let's talk about sleep. This is another area you get into in the book and discuss its relationship with uric acid. So let's get into some of the specifics there and why that's important for somebody who's trying to get uric acid under control.
Sure. So, I think the biggest lever to pull is food, no question. But other lifestyle issues are related to elevated uric acid that are good to discuss, like not having enough or enough restorative sleep. So that is associated with an elevation of uric acid. So the mission there is to ask yourself how long are you sleeping? And most people will tell you they sleep X number of hours a night. The second question, then, how well are you sleeping? Well, who would know, right? How do you know how much time you're spending in deep sleep and REM sleep? How long did it take you to fall asleep? How many times did you wake up or get into a light sleep which isn't really restorative? So that brings into our discussion the notion of a wearable device that can give you that information so that you can continue to make changes in your sleep hygiene, your choices related to sleep, and try to get more out of it. So I choose to wear a device called an Aura Ring, and then in the morning that downloads into my smartphone. It says you got however many hours of sleep last night, and here are the various sleep stages that you went through. How much time did you spend in each sleep stage? And you get a score. And it can be a crappy score, like 75, or you can nail it and get a 96 or 97. I think 97 or 98 is the highest score I've ever gotten. Beyond that, which is not exactly the question that you asked me, though, they give you what's called a readiness score that looks at other things, other factors that tell you, are you now in good shape for your day? And that includes looking at something called heart rate variability, which is a measurement of how your body copes with stress, which is an important factor to know about in terms of how you functional you're going to be during the day. But nonetheless, getting a good night's sleep, which is both appropriate in length and restorative, is really important for keeping uric acid levels in the optimal range. And in having said that, um, we know that sleep is really important for reining in metabolic issues as well. That not getting enough of this really quality sleep is associated with type 2 diabetes, with elevation of blood sugar even before diabetes. It's associated with significant weight gain, higher cortisol level, higher levels of stress response. And now that we understand this relationship to uric acid, you wonder if it's possibly uric acid that's mediating this, that's mediating, this increased risk for insulin resistance and weight gain. Maybe it is through the uric acid elevation. I don't know, how you would prove that. But when you think about the earlier studies that elevated uric acid by giving fructose, perhaps you could do nothing for a person in terms of their sleep environment, so they still have a noisy background or a little light in the room, or they're watching TV until 10 o'clock at night, whatever it may be that's giving them a not as restorative sleep. But maybe you take one group and give them a drug if you had a controlled trial, and the other group perhaps not. I would suggest give one group 500 milligrams of quercetin and the other group not. Watch their uric acid levels, and at the same time, then follow their weight, follow their blood sugars, their insulin resistance. I think that'd be a really cool study.
Coming back to the Aura Ring, I'm a big fan as well. And I'm just curious on a personal level, when it comes to sleep, what are some of the things that you notice make the biggest changes for you that you're
For
doing
me,
before bed that have the greatest impact on you
yeah.
sleeping well?
For me, so I've generally, there are other areas that I work on a lot more, but I do sleep really well, hell or high water. So that's something I've always done. But I have noted a significant improvement with my wife, and I have now started walking in the evening. We generally exercise in the morning quite aggressively, but now we're walking after dinner around the neighborhood for a lot of reasons. Especially now during COVID, it's so good to get out and see your neighbors and say hello outside. So we're doing that, and I've noted that since we started that, both her and my sleep markers are really definitely better. So that's something that really has I've noticed the improvement with that. And also keeping dinner at a really early hour. We do that to extend this period of time when we're not eating. So don't eat late. Try to make your breakfast a little bit later in the morning so you have a longer window of fasting. We call this, well, I don't call it, but it's been called time restricted eating.
Well, let's talk more about that because that fits into the uric acid piece. There's not a double edged sword, but the fact that when we fast, it does affect uric acid, but there are these other health benefits. So I'll have you take that and explain.
There's really not much data on the notion of time restricted eating in terms of elevating the uric acid. So I don't think we should really expect a dramatic change in uric acid from time restricted eating. But time restricted eating turns out to be a powerful tool for improving metabolic health. And that's why we have a chapter on that in our book, or a section in the book on this notion of compressing the eating that you do in a 24-hour period to a smaller window, if you will, such that, mom said breakfast is the most important meal. And I think absolutely, now that we understand time restricted eating, mom was right. Mom kind of focused on what we had for breakfast, not when we had our breakfast. And some people say, "Oh, I skip breakfast 3 times a week, whatever." Nobody ever skips breakfast. There's not anyone on the planet who skips breakfast. Why? Because ultimately you eat. That's when you break fast. You break your fast. So ultimately, everybody eats their breakfast. Now, I might choose to have my breakfast at 10 a.m. or noon. Oftentimes it's much later than that. Then from that time, that's the eating window. That might go until about 6:30, 6:45, maybe 7 p.m. That's the period during which I eat in the day. Then from 7 p.m. until 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, noon the next day, I'm not eating. And therefore, that's a big window during which I'm fasting. And as Dr. Sachin Panda has indicated, man, there are some great metabolic benefits of involving yourself in that regimen of, again, not looking specifically at what you eat, though clearly that's important, but when you eat. And the notion of compressing your food consumption to a window, a smaller window, really, like lowering your uric acid, is a powerful tool for reining in metabolic mayhem.
So when it comes to the uric acid fasting connection, is that more for 24 hours and longer fasts?
That's right. There are very few studies on that, but what the studies have indicated is that, over weeks to months, when people fast for a couple of days or 3 or 4 days during a week, um, that yes, their uric acid levels, as expected, do go up during that period of time, but they very rapidly drop back down to normal, or actually slightly lower than normal. So a manifestation of a benefit from fasting, which we've always been advocates of, once that fasting has been completed. So it's a good point, because when people are checking their uric acid levels, you will definitely notice, if you're on a 2 or 3 day fast, it's going to go up, as you would expect, because now you're in a state of catabolism. You're breaking down your body tissue for fuel, and that's going to release these purines, which are going to be recycled into, or going to form, uric acid. And you will definitely see the elevation, and it can be a point or two, and you got to watch that. But then if you keep testing, once you've started refeeding or eating again, those levels will return to normal, or possibly even below that level where they were before.
So it sounds like uric acid can come back down relatively quickly,
It
which
does.
leads me to my question of when people start applying all the different stuff we're talking about today, and say they were at a level like a 7 or 6.5, how long can they expect till they get down to, 5.5 or below?
It's very rapid. Of course, it depends on the individual, but typically it's within a couple of weeks. So, this isn't like looking at your hemoglobin A1C, where it's going to be, months that till you really see a significant change. Once you've implicated some changes, it happens very, very quickly. A matter of fact, as it relates to cessation of fructose, man, that can happen within a number of days. You will definitely see those changes. Add in some quercetin, some vitamin C, 500 milligrams a day, and these changes happen very quickly. The good news is that's very rewarding. All of a sudden, you get a lower measurement, and you see, that's I'm doing something right. I understand this relationship to my metabolic health, and that's very encouraging to people to see that.
Say somebody's just getting into this and they're a little bit older and they've been abusing their uric acid and they've had elevated levels for years and years and years. If they start, taking care of that and again, applying what we're talking about today, and they bring that level back down to a normal range, will there be long-term complications from having that elevated level for say 20 years before that? Or if they can get that back down, do they reap a lot of these benefits?
Well, that's a difficult question. Number one, can everybody get their level below 5.5? The answer is no. There are always going to be outliers who might do everything and still have whatever the problem may be. Number one. Number two, will that be incredibly beneficial for their metabolic health? Yes, it will be. And then third part of your question is, will that reverse the damage done by the years of elevated uric acid and the damaging effects that had on their metabolic health? I think that's difficult to say, and probably 100% isn't going to happen. It will improve their metabolic situation. Will there likely be some damage that has been done? I would say quite likely, yes. So the point I'm trying to make is that, intervening early is the key here. John Kennedy said that the time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. So our mission is to really target the avids, the 30-year-olds who may have already started having slight issues with their weight and their blood pressure and their blood sugars, and their uric acid levels are creeping up year after year on their annual blood work, to really give them this powerful tool that can help rein this in. If somebody is age 60 and they're already a diabetic and have high blood pressure and all these metabolic issues, it's a powerful tool for them as well. So that's, we're not taking anybody off the table. And to be perfectly frank, there may have been some damage. Um, Nerve damage in the diabetic, for example, brain damage in the diabetic, nerve damage in patients who are significantly overweight or obese from the inflammation chemicals. So some of this may not go away, and that's unfortunate. But can we slow down the decline? Yeah, that's the hope. But certainly, as I mentioned, we want to keep the younger people who don't have not accumulated these damaging events from getting there in the first place.
And David, do you feel like this information is getting out there in a general sense? Because before reading your book, I had so little knowledge about uric acid, and I've went to chiropractic college and I've learned about, how it can lead to gout and very basic stuff. And that to date was all my knowledge about uric acid. And I'm, reading these books each and every week, preparing for interviews, and this is my passion in my life, studying this stuff. So if I haven't seen any of this, do you feel like this book is groundbreaking, or are there other people that are starting to talk about this?
Well, I think it's groundbreaking for sure. That's a bit of a compliment. So what can I say? It's my own book. It's definitely out there. I mean, 10 years ago, I wrote a book called Grain Brain, where we talked about having high levels of refined carbohydrates and sugar and gluten in your diet could be threatening for the brain. And it really raised the level of the spotlight on these issues, which initially mainstream medicine didn't embrace. Now we know, that there's great science that is supportive of these notions. The idea that your average blood sugar, your hemoglobin A1C, is predictive of brain shrinkage. We put that in Grain Brain in the book, and people just could not get their arms around that because we were told that a certain amount of sugar is fine, go for it. And it reminds me that in February of this year, in MedPage Today, I published an op-ed along with a Dr. Casey Means, which was a letter to President Biden challenging the USDA's recommendation for allowing 10% of our daily calories to come from sugar. There was no scientific input that said that was a good move. And yet, in 2020, that was approved. And here we go for another 5 years. That's how long those recommendations stand. The recommendation from the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is involved in growing corn, that we subsidize to the tune of $500 billion a year, no influence there, telling us go stay with your sugar consumption. There's no reasonable scientist or clinician that's going to tell anybody that that's a good idea. We said, let's keep it at 6%, which is what your scientist told you. And, we haven't really seen any response to that. But therefore, it's up to us to be, sort of the vanguards and be as vociferous as possible. Not that Dr. Perlmutter makes this stuff up. This book is written after reviewing more than 400 peer-reviewed research papers from around the world, recognizing that there are various parts of the world that are way ahead of us in terms of understanding uric acid. In Japan, they are treating patients with high blood pressure by giving them drugs to lower their uric acid. That's been demonstrated, at least here in America, in studies. They get it, and they're having great success with that. So, is it out of the box? You bet. That's not the mission. The mission is not to say, oh, that's really out of the box thinking. The ultimate mission is to make the box bigger, to make the box more inclusive, and to recognize that we should be following uric acid and blood pressure and blood sugar and body mass index as powerful metrics to risk for metabolic issues. And you are very early in understanding this. You got an advanced copy of this information, but a lot of people who are forward thinking already understand this. I mean, I learned this by listening to a podcast. That's what got me lit up a year ago, a little over a year ago, a podcast from it was of a researcher, Dr. Richard Johnson in University of Colorado, who's been studying this and publishing papers on this for, I think he's written over 200 papers and for the past 20 years. And I became friendly with him, speak to him on the phone, and we have frequent conferences. And his research is a lot of what we quote in the book. I dedicated this book to him as a way of saying thank you for revealing this to me as I have revealed this to you, and making this science so available to us. And I ended up writing the foreword to his new book, which is interestingly called Why Nature Wants Us to Be Fat. Again, getting back to this relationship about how making fat and raising our blood pressure was a survival mechanism. So, uh, the first book written on this topic was just published in 1894 by Dr. Alexander Haig, calling, really calling out the role of elevated uric acid well beyond gout, but in various metabolic issues like elevated blood pressure and neurological issues like dementia and depression. This is old news. That happened in 1894. And, it took a researcher like Dr. Johnson and people around the world in places like Japan and Turkey to really resurrect this role. We want to pigeonhole things into one area, and that's it. Uric acid, gout, kidney stones, end of story. Testosterone, it's a male hormone, end of story. Uh, Cholecystokinin is only about the gallbladder. No, why would there be cholecystokinin receptors throughout the gut, in the brain, throughout the body? So it does many things. Why do women, if it's a male hormone, why do women's bodies have testosterone receptors? We know that testosterone is important for men and women. So it is with gout and then uric acid. It's a much, much bigger story than this. Is not your grandfather's uric acid anymore.
And when it comes to your medical training, was it similar to mine where, you know, uric acid might have been part of one lecture, a couple of slides type of thing?
I would say no. I would say that your medical training was in many ways better than mine because you likely had nutrition training as part of your education, and I did not. So, as far as the uric acid part of the lecture, which might have been 20 minutes, looking at uric acid metabolism, perhaps looking at something called porphyria. There's a relationship there, a disease called Lesch-Nyhan syndrome in which they accumulate uric acid. That would probably be the extent of it. But, you likely had the benefit of looking at nutrition. Gosh. Uh, that doesn't happen very often in medical school to this day.
A little bit, but not enough.
Yeah, not enough, that's for sure.
And when it comes to, you've talked about a few different supplements, quercetin, vitamin C. I know another one you mentioned in the book is
Luteolin.
DHA, luteolin. When it comes to using these as alternatives to the drug allopurinol, how effective are they for somebody that might be on a drug right now and saying, there might be something less invasive, something that can work in the natural realm as well or even better? How do they compare?
Well, that's a very good question. And research shows that luteolin is about as effective as allopurinol in terms of lowering uric acid. Who knew? I think that's really kind of valuable that people know that there is a health food store item that is a natural plant-based supplement that they can be taking to help keep their uric, even if you have gout. And I'm not telling people what they should be doing, but it's important to know that. So luteolin 100 milligrams per day, along with quercetin 500 milligrams per day. So there was a study published in the British Journal of Nutrition using 22 young men, and they had mild elevation of their uric acid. They put them on 500 milligrams of quercetin a day, and in just 2 weeks' time, their uric acid levels fell by 8%. That's dramatic. That's a significant reduction. That was only in 2 weeks. So I'm a big proponent for many, many reasons for taking quercetin. I take myself 1,000 milligrams per day for purposes of the research on quercetin, which is pretty extensive. As it relates to uric acid, by and large, the dosage used was 500 milligrams. Quercetin, yeah, it has anti-inflammatory activity, it has antioxidant activity, but beyond this really powerful role in reducing uric acid production, Quercetin is telling the body that it's activating a pathway that's telling the body there's no reason to store fat. In fact, burn fat and we won't stimulate your body's making more blood sugar in the liver. And this is a pathway. I don't want to be too technical, but maybe some of your viewers have heard of it, called AMP kinase or AMPK. So that's a pathway we really want to be active, because that's the pathway that, again, tells us we can be a fat burning machine. We don't have to raise our blood pressure, our blood sugar. We can engage in autophagy, which is clearing out the damaged cellular material. We want to keep our AMP kinase active. When AMP kinase is active, our bodies will make less blood sugar in the liver, a process called gluconeogenesis. In fact, targeting this AMP kinase pathway, stimulating it, is how the diabetes drug metformin actually works, one of the reasons. So we want to keep AMP kinase active. Well, guess what? Not always. If you're a bear and you're getting ready to hibernate, you want to be making fat and storing fat and reducing your metabolic rate so that you're going to survive your hibernation. And it's at that time that the bear shuts down AMP kinase and activates a different pathway for metabolism of AMP called AMP deaminase. We did that in our ancestral times as well as a way of survival. And you target that, you increase AMP deaminase and make fat and store fat and make blood sugar and become insulin resistant with uric acid. Uric acid shuts down AMP kinase. It's working against you, and it's activating this other pathway that's saying, hey, we need to get you ready to hibernate. So the question then to all of your viewers is, are you getting ready to hibernate? Are you getting ready to go to sleep in a cave for the next 6 months, in which case you're trying to store as much fat as possible? That's what happens when you eat a lot of fructose, purines, alcohol, eat a lot of salt. You're telling your body, get ready for the winter that will never come.
And when it comes to AMP kinase, other than uric acid and managing that in a good way, what are some of the things that we can do, either diet or lifestyle, to give that a boost?
I think one of the most powerful things that will activate AMP kinase is exercise. We all know that exercise is good for us, but to switch from AMP deaminase and activate AMP kinase, help with our blood sugar, bypassing even the role of insulin. If a person's insulin resistant, that's why we want AMP kinase to be lit up. So that's huge. Supplements include, as I mentioned, quercetin, berberine also does it, and indeed, there are medications. As I mentioned, metformin will light up AMP kinase as well, as will dietary restriction. So I think that this is a little bit of a deeper dive into these switches that are being turned on and turned off in our bodies. And there's nothing bad about AMP deaminase. There's nothing bad about making this fat and storing the fat and raising our blood pressure and becoming insulin resistant in the context of needing to survive. When that bear is getting ready to go into the cave, that bear is highly insulin resistant. There's a dramatic change in its gut bacteria that corresponds to that insulin resistance. How much body fat is he laying down, or she, to get into that cave and store that energy, have a resource for fresh water during the months and months of hibernation? But again, so it's not bad or good in the context. It's the context that matters. It's really good that that happened to our ancestors because it paved the way for their survival. And again, this was a set of mutations that took place during the middle Miocene period, when the Earth cooled, and our primate ancestors had more difficulty in finding food. So that was a really powerful environmental pressure. Those who made more fat, because they had the uricase mutation, would survive and pass that mutation on to us. We all have it. Every human walking the planet has a uricase mutation and accumulates uric acid. Dinosaurs had it. That Sioux, the T-Rex that they found in South Dakota, had gout. in her toes. And you always see these pictures of T-Rex looking so angry. Always wonder why they're so angry. Well, at least Sue had gout, and so birds as well. I mentioned earlier the hummingbird, but what what a powerful tool for putting calories away as a hedge against starvation, but also as a hedge against becoming dehydrated.
If we go far enough back into history, do we know whereabouts that uricase mutation took place?
Yes. In fact, we know, I wouldn't, you may not consider this to be quite specific, but we know within a few million years that it took place sometime between 14 to, let's say, 18 million years ago. That prior to that, we didn't have this mutation. There was no need to really be making more body fat. And the truth is that it's not as if these primate ancestors became fat, would lay around with a big belly. It's just a little bit of a selective advantage by having just a little bit more body fat, just a little bit more activation of these pathways to store that fat, to have a resource for calories and fresh water in their bodies. It didn't take a lot, as environmental pressure acting over millions of years, then to tease out one group being favored to survive versus another group that would perish by virtue of the fact that it did not store that extra little bit of fat. So, the notion that they stored fat and survived, I want to be clear, doesn't mean that they got what we would call fat or became obese and hypertensive. No, they, in relation to those who did not have the uricase mutation, it was a small but very, very important selective advantage.
So, when it comes to uric acid and lifestyle, we've talked about sleep, we've talked about fasting, we've talked about what was the other lifestyle one?
We
Sleep,
didn't talk
fasting,
about it, but exercise should be on the table.
exercise. No, we did mention it, but we might want to go a bit deeper into it. That was the other
Yeah, I
one I was
think we
thinking.
mentioned it in the context of AMP kinase activation, but generally, across the board for metabolism, we really want to amp up our level of exercise. That doesn't mean people need to start training for marathons, but at a minimum, I would say at least daily of 20 minutes of something that gets your heart rate up. It's a very crude number, but I tell people generally shoot for a heart rate of 180 minus your age. Now, that might be too low, that might be too high. It might be something you can't achieve because you're on a blood pressure pill like a beta blocker that's going to keep your pulse rate low. Or you may tolerate a much higher pulse rate. I know that I do. I tolerate a much higher pulse rate. It's because I do it a lot, but interestingly, primitive cultures that have not adopted a Western diet, even these days, which have been identified, um, have better what is called VO2 max, better physical conditioning, better ability to withstand exercise, better blood pressure, less of an increase in blood pressure based upon their age, better visual parameters, better bone density, and lower uric acid. So the uric acid elevation that we are seeing, which is quite pervasive now, is a brand new phenomenon. I think it probably began in a mild way with agriculture 14 to 17,000 years ago, but really exploded quite recently, past 200 and more so in the past 100 years. We know that uric acid in the 1920s average was around 3.5, and then by 1990 increased to 6, above 5.5, so 6. And it very much paralleled this dramatic increased consumption of fructose that we have seen that is, certainly well documented. Good news is that it seems like fructose consumption is starting to level off and maybe even decline a little bit. But and that happened because of people finally getting dialed in on sugar sweetened soft drinks. The problem is that now people are gravitating towards what are called sports drinks because they're somewhat better because they're labeled as being sports drinks because they have electrolytes. But make no mistake about it, they may be, I'm sure there are some that are not, but they may be loaded with sugar to give you the energy you need for your workout. But By and large in your workout, you're going to be burning you should be burning your glycogen stores that'll easily get you through your typical 1 hour workout or hour and a half, whatever it may be.
If somebody is looking for a healthy alternative, though, during a workout to, replenish those electrolytes and give them a bit of energy, what would you recommend? Coconut water, or is there something that you would
Well,
tell people?
if I think that you ought to realize that you really do have enough glycogen stores to get you through up to a 2 hour workout, a strenuous workout for a couple of hours. At that point, uh, be for marathon runners, around 13 miles, you've exhausted them, and then you're going to need some support unless you are fully keto adapted, in which case you have an incredibly robust resource of fat calories. We all do, both throughout our bodies that we can tap into. What else should people think about doing? I think the bigger issue that seems to be limiting in terms of exercise is these changes that people experience in their electrolytes. So I think prior to wanting to add in a sports drink that's really high in sugar, see if there are sports drinks available to you that are mostly, based upon the fact that they contain some low levels of sodium, but also potassium and magnesium. There is one product that I use called Element that has sodium, potassium, and magnesium, and you can dump it into a glass of water, no sugar, and then home free. You've got your electrolytes for whether you're in ketosis or you're going into the sauna or you're exercising aggressively. Oftentimes that's the issue. It's not the fact that you're running out of sugar. Everybody thinks, oh, I'm going to be drinking the sports drink because I'm going to go lift. And, for 45 minutes, probably unnecessary. Individual results may vary, but I think probably unnecessary. I think first concentrate on the electrolytes and hydration, of course.
I'm a big fan of Element as well. They're a sponsor of the show, something I consume on a daily basis.
There you go.
So, any other lifestyle factors that we want to consider when it comes to uric acid?
I would say that the main issue that we're discussing today is metabolic health, and there are plenty of other things to think about that play into metabolic health that are lifestyle related. We covered sleep, we covered exercise. I think getting out into nature is a very effective tool in terms of reducing inflammation and, as such, having an impact on metabolic health. And I think there's certainly a very important role for meditation, which helps to bring online the prefrontal cortex so that we can make these important lifestyle decisions as opposed to relying on what our primitive brain wants us to do in terms of the foods we know darn well we shouldn't eat, but we're not going to be able to help ourselves. Bringing that prefrontal cortex online is bringing the adult back into the room and helping us with our decision making. I find that the use of a continuous glucose monitor is really helpful in understanding moment to moment your blood sugar. And not just that, but thinking about your blood sugar in terms of what you're doing today or you did yesterday in terms of food and activity and sleep and stress management. How does that play out in terms of this really important metric, fundamentally important metric, which is your blood sugar? So, to have the ability to check your blood sugar at any moment by just taking your smartphone and putting it by your patch and reading what that is, I think is really a very high level of personal empowerment as it relates to regaining your health. I believe that sooner than later, you'll be able to know your uric acid on your smartphone with similar technology. And that's how important I think this uric acid story will become. Hey, Jess, you're early to the game here. You know what I mean? You're, I would say, riding the crest of the wave, but the wave hasn't even really started yet, and you're going to be right in, on the leading edge of this. So it's new. I understand that, but we've got to keep pushing the ball down the field if we're going to make progress. We cannot settle for the status quo because right now, metabolically, globally, the status quo is very, very worrisome. Even at this moment when we know that metabolic issues set the stage for bad outcome from COVID infection. We all know that people who are overweight or have hypertension or have diabetes across the board have a much higher risk of bad outcome. Now, there's research showing that if you are admitted to the hospital because of COVID and you're hospital admission uric acid is elevated, you have as much as tripled your risk for ending up in the ICU, tripled your risk for getting on a ventilator, and tripled your risk for ending up dying from COVID in relationship to having a high uric acid level. Now, is that a direct effect of the uric acid level, or is it because the uric acid level then sets you up for metabolic issues? I don't think that's been teased out yet, but that's a pretty important thing to consider when people are hearing this podcast and wondering, does this really matter? Well, it does matter. I mentioned to you quite a while ago about just having an increased risk of all-cause mortality. Um, being, dying from any cause just from in association with an elevated uric acid. That was long before COVID. That was in 2009, but a massive study, 90,000 people. So it matters a whole heck of a lot. And I'm so happy to share this with you so that you're up to speed on this really important new biometric. And you and I together will watch as all this information unfolds in the coming years, knowing full well that you were really early to the party.
Well, in wrapping up here, I want to talk about a beverage you're a big fan of, and me as well, and that's coffee, and how that fits into the whole uric acid picture.
Coffee is associated with a lower uric acid. Home run. Um, It would have been really tough for me if the literature showed otherwise, that uric acid is elevated by coffee. But I would have made the change because, yeah, I look forward to having coffee in the morning too. It just does good things to me. I feel really much better with it. But knowing the importance of uric acid, if the literature had indicated that coffee raised uric acid, I would have quit it. Even though I enjoy how I feel with coffee, I would have quit. I've made other changes that I didn't want to make in my lifestyle choices over the years, like salt. I used to love salt. Um, but you do these things because you understand the science behind them and the implication of these behavioral changes. So you do the adult thing. You give up, for me, the salt shaker once you recognize this relationship. So lots of things. You become a more cognizant label reader and recognize that there's such an effort to disguise the name of fructose on a label. In the book, we have a full page just dedicated with all the names of fructose that people, in a very sneaky way, try to get sugar into your food. We're on to it. And that's why we write the books that we do. It's a level, doctor doesn't mean healer, it means teacher. So my hope is to give out information that's empowering people. So, step one is seeing it. Step two is employing this to bring about improvements in health, and importantly, to help keep people healthy before they develop not only these metabolic problems, but the downstream consequences, the heart disease, the Alzheimer's, cancer, diabetes, and so many more, representing the chronic degenerative conditions, what the World Health Organization to this day indicates are the number one cause of death on our planet, not an infection of one sort or another. It's the chronic degenerative, read lifestyle choice related diseases that we can avoid if we know what to do.
Well, the beautiful thing about a lot of this information that you're sharing, it runs parallel with what a lot of people are teaching and a lot of people are doing to elevate their health and wellness to the next level. So it's not like this is counter, pushing back against everything else people are learning if they're regular
Exactly right.
listeners of the show.
We made it very clear in the nutrition section of Drop Acid that this approach is totally consistent with paleo, keto, vegan, whatever your choice may be. Looking at your dietary choices through this lens, staying with the paradigm that resonates with you for whatever reason, but now adding this new metric. All right, how are the various nuances of my diet playing out as it relates to this new metric, uric acid? So we wanted to be as inclusive as possible because people are choosing to follow a very various paradigms as it relates to their food choices, and There are upsides to everything I mentioned and many more, that's for sure. So wherever you're comfortable, great. But look at how that's playing out in terms of your uric acid. Then you can make these important changes along with, the current dietary paradigm that you like or appreciate and take it from there.
Well, David, really enjoyed the conversation, really enjoyed the new book. Other than people getting a copy of Drop Acid, how can they connect with you after the show?
I'm available at drperlmutter.com. Who knew? drperlmutter.com. That'll be a clearinghouse for Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, not TikTok. I haven't haven't gone there yet. I don't know if I ever will. But also, is a good entree to the Empowering Neurologist is the YouTube channel that I have where I do like you're doing now, interview people who have something important, I think, to add. And I do a lot of blog writing as well. So drperlmutter.com is a great place to get started.
All right. Going to link it all up in the show notes. David, again, really enjoyed this. Thank you.
Jesse, great to see you. Thanks for having me today.
Thank you.